праздником вас! С Днем Великой Победы! Ура!
It's this hypocrisy because the United States had a long record of consorting with tyrants, from Videla in Argentina to Pinochet in Chile, Somoza in Nicaragua. Did I pronounce that correctly? Nicaragua, yeah. And Stroessner, they pronounce it in Paraguay. As long as they backed American interests. Under George W. Bush, he would continue to support undemocratic regimes in the Middle East, notably Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, whose propagation of Wahhabite fundamentalism was one of the well springs of Islamic terrorism. The Soviet Union, of course, had done exactly the same. For decades, Moscow opposed its will on its satellites in Eastern Europe, and had supported singularly vile third world dictatorships. But as far as Putin was concerned, that was not his problem. It was a classic case of two powerful countries talking past each other and refusing to look in the mirror. That had been so throughout the Cold War. The antagonisms which came into focus in the winter of 2004 were in this pronounced word here, an entomorph of the problems of the 1960s and the 70s. Russia was no longer trying to export its ideology and value system. Indeed, America was. Bush's State of the Union address, coupled with the Rose Revolution in Georgia, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, and a few months later the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan, where the government was overthrown in March 2005, convinced Putin that genuine partnership with the United States, let alone an alliance, was going to be a challenge. NATO enlargement, from the Kremlin standpoint, had been provocative enough, but that had started when Yeltsin was in power, and there was little that Putin could do about it. Iraq had been irritant, but Putin's reaction, as one American official put it, had been more in sorrow than in anger. The colour revolutions posed a threat of a different order. They risked jeopardising Moscow's position on its own turf, inside a post-Soviet space. It did not require a great stretch of imagination on Putin's part to suspect that behind Bush's professions of friendship, the US government, or at least a powerful element within it, was playing a double game. Up till then, both sides had been at pains to play down the differences. Bush, because he assumed that, in the end, Moscow would accept Washington's choices. Putin, because he remained convinced that good relations with the United States were one of the keys to Russia's future. But now it was clear to the Kremlin, if not yet to the White House, that much more difficult times lay ahead. The gradual erosion of Russia's relationship with Washington was mirrored by changes in its relations with the main Western European powers, Britain, France and Germany. Britain's Tony Blair had initially been closest to Putin, providing a value channel to the White House during the first year of the presidency. Afterwards, Gerhard Schroeder, who had succeeded Helmut Kohl, the German Chancellor, inherited that mantle. He and Putin developed a close political relationship and became good personal friends. Putin's affection for Germany and his fluency in the language helped. Both men came from modest backgrounds. Schroeder had left school at 14, studied at night school, and eventually, like Putin, obtained a law degree. In January 2001, he and his wife stayed at Novo Ograyovo for the Orthodox Christmas holiday. Later, Putin helped them adopt a 3-year-old Russian girl from an orphanage in St. Petersburg. Relations with France were at first more distant because of the French criticism of Russian policy in Chechnya and the peculiar complexity of French politics at a time when a right-wing President, Jacques Chirac, shared power with Lionel Jospin, a left-wing Prime Minister. Putin had grown used to dealing with European sniping over Chechnya. To begin with, he admitted Russia had responded to criticisms, quote, by looking at its partners with sad eyes or moving something incoherently as though it had mad cow disease. Can't way of putting it. Now he took them in his stride. He found the relationship between Chirac and Jospin much harder to fathom. Hubert Védrine, the French foreign minister, remembered Putin asking him during a visit to Paris, which had the final say, the president who determined foreign policy or the prime minister who headed the government. The only thing that interested Putin, Védrine said, was where the power lay, a tricky question to which there was not always a simple answer. 18 months later, in June 2002, after Chirac's re-election, his party regained control of parliament and power sharing came to an end. By then, France's relationship with Russia was on a different level. Chirac, Schroeder and Putin all opposed the invasion of Iraq and started holding tripartite summits to coordinate their positions. Blair, who had sided with Bush, was excluded. The schism, as British officials called the European divide of Iraq, had lingering effects. It was difficult to put the pieces back together again after the conflict. Blair's foreign policy advisor Nigel Sheinwald remembered. Years later, he will be seen as one of the cracks in the facade of the European unity, which would culminate in Brexit. I'm not sure I'll get that far, but let's just go with that for the time being. Putin nursed a grudge against Blair, who he thought, like Bush, had lied to him about preparations for Iraq invasion. For the most part, he kept it hidden, but occasionally a glimmer of irritation would break through. His taunting of Blair over Saddam's non-existent weapons of mass destruction had been one such instance. Another occurred when he paid a state visit to Britain in the summer of 2003 and grumbled about the pomp and ceremony in having to wear tails. I can't say that I liked it. It's very uncomfortable, he said. It was intentionally churlish and a bleak jab at the fading grandeur of a nation that he was beginning to find even more annoying than its American cousins, and stood in marked contrast to his first visit 3 years earlier, when he met the Queen for tea at Windsor Castle, and he'd be agreeable surprised by her interest in Russia. By now, other problems were intruding. Boris Berezovsky and the Chechen Foreign Minister Ahmed Zakayev had both applied to Britain for political asylum. In September, the Home Office granted Berezovsky's request. Zakayev's application was approved 2 months later. Russia had been seeking their extradition, Berezovsky to face trial for embezzlement and fraud, for which he was later sentenced to absentia for 2 years of imprisonment, and Zakayev for allegedly terrorist offences. In Berezovsky's case, extradition proceedings were abandoned because he had been granted refugee status. In Zakayev's, the judge ruled the accusations were politically motivated, and there was a risk they would be tortured if he was returned to Moscow. Britain insisted that the government had no control over the courts. Tony Brenton, who arrived in Moscow as a British ambassador a year later, found that whenever he talked to Russian officials, the first thing they brought up was the two men's extradition. I used to tell them, Brenton said, I can't do that. Tony Blair can't do that. You need to persuade a British judge to send them back. That was being economical with the truth. The reason they could not be extradited was that the British government, through the Home Office, had granted them asylum. Blair might claim they had no choice because both men risk persecution for their political views if they returned to Russia, but it was a harder case to argue than just saying that the courts were responsible. Putin did not buy it. From Moscow's standpoint, Zakayev was a spokesman for the Chechen jihadi movement, whose members committed terrorist acts, and Berezovsky, even if he had done no more than other Russian oligarchs, had used dubious, if not criminal methods to build his business empire, which he had done. By granting him asylum, in Zakayev's case, showing off the Beslan massacre, the British government had made clear they did not trust the Russian justice system to deal with them fairly. On that score, the British were correct. What in Soviet times had been called telephone justice was much part of Putin's repertoire, as it had been of his Soviet predecessors. There was now a new name for it, Basmamy justice, after the Korun Basmamy district of Moscow, northeast of Lubyanka, to which the Kremlin confided politically sensitive proceedings. But it worked in exactly the same way, judges handed down the sentences the authorities had determined in advance. Putin's delusionment with Blair was reciprocated. Within the British government, there was as Scheinwald put it, an increasing realization of the degree of oppression in Russia and of Putin's character and methods. Blair felt let down by Putin, who was emerging a more overtly brutal and autocratic Putin than the one he hoped for. Over the next few years, that view became more widely shared in Europe. Gerhard Schroeder, who had argued that it was the wrong place to place excessive demands on Russia when it comes to the rate of domestic political reform, was replaced by Angela Merkel, who had grown up in East Germany and had far fewer illusions about Russia. In Italy, the ambivalent Silvio Berlusconi, with whom Putin had developed a warm relationship, sending his daughters to spend holidays with the Prime Minister's children at the family villa in Sardinia, was succeeded by the cerebral Romano Prodi. In France, Nicolas Sarkozy, an impulsive right-winger who was unknown and quantity in Moscow, took over from Jacques Chirac. Despite the changes, Russia's relations with the European Union continued to make progress. Areas of cooperation known as common spaces were established covering economic relations, security, legal affairs, external security, and science, education and culture. And there was renewed talk, though only talk, of easing visa requirements. But the political climate in Europe was distinctly cooler than during Putin's first years in power. For Moscow, Britain became a touchstone, a place to probe America's intentions and reactions to Russia's initiative without endangering the core relationship with the United States itself. The chill that had set in after the invasion of Iraq was felt across the board. When Richard Dearlove visited Moscow in 2004 for talks with Patrushev, his opposite number in FSB, he found that, quote, the shutters were coming down. Blair's contacts with Putin became less frequent. Scheinwald spoke of a slow burn. Russian commentators wrote that relations were deteriorating. Ambassador Brenton tried to put a good face on it. They were doing things that we didn't like, he said, but fundamentally these were problems of the country which was still finding its feet after the collapse of communism. The expectation was that we would work our way through this and Russia would become a normal member of the international community. With hindsight, that appears naive, but it was a view widely shared in the West at that time. Outwardly, relations were correct. When Blair visited Moscow in June 2005, Putin received him at Novo Ogorovo rather than the Kremlin, which was seen as a positive gesture, and he appeared to take pleasure in showing Blair around the grounds. In July, during the Gleneagles G8 summit, when Islamist terrorists killed more than 50 people in the suicide bombings in London, the British found Putin magnanimous and supportive of everything you would expect a leader to be. 3 months later, when he visited Britain again for a Russia-EU summit, Russian journalists noted appreciatively that Blair had invited Putin to his home, where he talked in a room cluttered with children's toys. But alongside these superficial courtesies, Putin was becoming deeply impatient of what he saw as British hypocrisy. Wealthy Russians with dubious backgrounds were granted residence and invested their fortunes in Britain. Putin's opponents were granted asylum. Blair seemed not to want to understand that he could not be both with Russia and against it. The Russians' leader frustration showed through again when he was taken to see Cobra, a secure briefing room beneath the Cabinet Office building where crisis meetings are held, to hear a briefing on the British counter-terrorism tactics in the wake of the London bombings. He listened for a while and then said quietly, quote, "You know how we deal with Islamic terrorists? We kill them." Even the Foreign Office, where the imperturbable optimism did duty as the diplomatic equivalent of the stiff upper lip, there was a growing recognition that all was not well. At the formal talks in Downing Street, when the subject of Berezovsky and Zakayev came up, the Foreign Secretary Jack Straw told Putin directly, "I wish I can get rid of these people that are damaging our relations." That's a quote from Jack Straw. From there on, it was all downhill. A row broke out with foreign and specifically British support of Russian NGOs, a subject which had been troubling Putin since the Rose Revolution in Georgia 2 years earlier, in which American financed NGOs had played a prominent role. Not all NGOs are oriented into standing up for people's real interests, Putin grumbled in the spring of 2004. For some of them, the priority is to receive funding from influential foreign foundations, and they can't bite the hand that feeds them. That's a good point. The following year, the FSB discovered an unusual dead letter drop in one of Moscow's garden squares. Disguised as a small rock near some bushes, it contained a device which was capable of receiving and storing electronic messages from specially equipped mobile phones carried by Russian informants. Their controllers, 4 MI6 officers under the diplomatic cover of the British Embassy, retrieved the messages electronically on a pocket-sized computer as they walked past. For several months, the story was kept on the wraps. Then, as through pulling a rabbit out of the hat, in January 2006, it was made public with great fanfare in a special program on the state-owned TV channel Russia 1. Espionage, however, was not the only accusation. The Russians claimed that the diplomats had also provided legal financing to Russian human rights organisations, a charge which the British government strongly denied. The accusation was designed to justify a bill imposing new restrictions on NGOs, which the Duma had passed a week earlier. The timing was such that some Russians suspected the whole story was a fabrication and that no rock had ever existed, fake or otherwise. That was not so. Blair's Chief of Staff, Jonathan Powell, acknowledged later that the rock, which was made of grey plastic, had been real enough and the MI6 had been caught with its pants down. Putin dismissed the episode as petty squabbling between the intelligence services, adding mischievously that the diplomats concerned would not be expelled because, if they were replaced, the successors might turn out to be more skillful. That's a quote from Putin. So despite that, back in the trouble they have with this alleged spy, which they obviously were spying with using these informants, and they were caught, and as the Chief of Staff, Jonathan Powell, described it, saying the MI6 has been caught with their pants down, Putin said, no, let's use it to our advantage. Let's not expel these guys. It's just one of those things that happens. They might bring in people a bit more skilled, so we'll prefer these guys instead. Keep them here. What was regrettable, he said, was the covert financing of non-governmental organisations. That money has a bad smell, he declared. We do not want our NGOs to be run by puppet masters from abroad. States cannot use NGOs as an instrument of foreign policy on the territory of others. What are they doing today? They're still doing the exact same thing in the United States. Even they got ones in Hungary. And if I was Orban, I'd be very careful. Orban might end up passing a law and banning this, doing this as well, which would be really, really pushing it. You might have seen protests in Budapest, but it's something you should seriously consider, because this is how they, one way or another, try to control things and trying to cause disturbances in states that are not quite friendly with the United States, if that's the best way to describe it. Much as he had done with the Duma, had passed harsh new restrictions on the media. After the Dubrovka attack, Putin watered down the NGO legislation, playing now the familiar role of the good Tsar, reproving bad boys, but the new laws remained sufficiently vague to give the authorities wide latitude to crack down if and when they wished. A few days later, the prosecutor's office announced that it was proceeding with a criminal investigation to the British Council Office in St. Petersburg for illegal commercial activities, which turned out to mean organising English language classes. The accusation was left hanging and muffled threats which could put into effect whenever the political situation required. In July 2006, when Russia was to host G8 in St. Petersburg, Tony Blair announced that he planned to attend an opening of the council's new offices on Nevsky Prospect. Not possible, he was told. The fire department refused to certify the building. In that case, Blair said he would conduct the opening ceremony on the pavement outside. Faced with a scandal on the eve of the summit, the Russians backed down. But the investigations into legal language teaching continued. The British Council's difficulties were not over, nor Ambassador Brenton's. A few days before the G8 meeting, he had addressed what was termed an alternative summit in Moscow, organised by leaders of several small opposition parties and human rights groups to discuss political freedoms. The Kremlin Youth Movement, Nashi, meaning ours, a name designed to underline the difference between what was Russian and what was not Russian or foreign, promptly demanding that he apologise for attending a fascist event. Nashi had been created by the Kremlin ideologist Vladislav Surkov, a talented, unconformable young man, half Chechen, half Russian. And he goes on here. His formal position was first deputy of the presidential administration. He had established Nashi to act as a shock force to support Putin should there be any attempt to launch an orange revolution in Russia. When no apology was forthcoming, Nashi members waving banners and chanting demands for Brenton's recall pictured the British embassy housed in a palatial 19th century merchant's home on the bank of the Moscow River opposite the Kremlin. It seemed to be straight out of the playbook of the Maoist Red Guards 40 years earlier. After far less violence, a sort of a cultural revolution light. The harassment continued intermittently for 18 months after one young man, who vowed to make Britain his personal affair, came to blows with an embassy guard. The Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, and that's a name you've heard quite often, haven't you, calling the movement leaders and reminding them of Russia's obligations under the Vienna Convention. It made little difference. The police were under orders not to intervene. The campaign against the British Council and the harassment of the British ambassador had Putin's authorization. But Britain was a surrogate target. The Kremlin was much more concerned about the United States democracy promotion initiatives and support for human rights groups through congressionally funded organizations like the National Endowment for Democracy. Putin was not ready to confront Washington directly and perhaps hoped he would not have to. Instead, he adopted the Chinese adage, pointing at the mulberry to curse the locust tree. The British Council's misfortunes, the Kremlin hoped, might make the Americans think again. Britain himself was a stalking horse too. American officials like Dan Freed, the Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, who had attended the same alternative summit, incurred none of the wrath that fell on their British colleague. When Alexander Verschbau, the American ambassador in Moscow for most of Putin's first term, was summoned to the Foreign Ministry for addressing down after attending an opposition conference on freedom of the press, he informed them, "I am here to defend American values." He too was spared the kind of harassment which Brenton had endured. By then, another incident had occurred whose significance was not recognised at the time, but whose effect was to make Putin even more jandized about the United States' role in the world. The Russian government announced in the summer of 2004 that the main production complex of Mikhail Khodorkovsky's Yukos oil company, Yugansnefgats, I think that's pronounced it, would be sold at auction to pay off the $27.5 billion in the back taxes which it claimed the company owed. Putin decided that Gazprom should buy it as part of the diversification program. A consortium of Western banks, headed by Deutsche Bank, had put together a loan package of some $18 billion. The company estimated the market value to finance the acquisition. Khodorkovsky's nemesis, Igor Sechin, now Rosneft's chairman, had strongly opposed the arrangement, supposing on the grounds that Western banks could not be trusted to finance a strategic asset, but in reality to defend his own turf. Gazprom, in Sechin's view, had no business involving itself in oil production. That was Rosneft's domain. Putin then decided that Gazprom and Rosneft should merge. That was partly a stop to the west, to mitigate the negative fallout from the rest of Khodorkovsky, and the breakup of Yukos. It would create a behemoth 5 times bigger than ExxonMobil, and restrictions on foreign participation, which had limited foreign ownership in Gazprom, would be lifted. It would also serve to reinforce Putin's control over the energy sector as a whole. Sechin liked that idea even less. Early in December, Putin called a meeting to discuss the takeover. Sechin dug in his heels, and the discussion degenerated until the president, finally losing his patience, told him that the decision had been taken, and if he did not wish to accept it, he could go, a reprimand which left him shaken. 4 days later in Texas, a judge in the district court in Houston granted Yukos and its American subsidiary an injunction barring Gazprom or any of the other prospective bidders from participating in the auction of Yugansnefgats pending Chapter 11 bankruptcy hearings. The Deutsche Bank consortium suspended the loan package for the fear of US sanctions. The auction went ahead nonetheless on December 19th. A previously unknown company, Baikal Finance Group, which had been hastily registered not long before at a building housing a vodka bar and a mobile phone shop in Putin's ancestral hometown of Tver, was the only bidder. Yugansnefgats changed hands for $9.3 billion, half its real value. 4 days later, Rosneft bought Baikal Finance Group, becoming the biggest oil company not only in Russia but the world. Sechin had won game, set and match. Not only had he gained control of Yugansnefgats, the crown jewel in Yukos' portfolio, but he had improved rights where Putin had been wrong. Western banks could not be relied upon, not because they were untrustworthy, but because international financial systems were under American control. And of course, if you think about today what's happening, this is part of the reasons why Russia, China, all the others are now saying, screw America, we're not going to let them control this anymore. It's strange how times have changed. This is back in what, in 2005, 2006? 15, 16 years ago? It says here that a district judge in Texas could block a financial transaction by the Russian state, excuse me, transaction by the Russian state carried out inside Russia showed in stark terms how far America's arms could reach. A few months later, the case was dismissed on the grounds that a Texas court had no jurisdiction, but by then the damage had been done. Publicly, Putin grouched about imperial extraterritorial judgments and asked whether the judge even knew where Russia is on the map. That's a good question for most Americans. Privately, he was shocked. It had brought home to him the extent to which the United States was still the global hegemon. Quite something that. There's a couple more pages and we'll end there, so a few more pages to go. When Putin next met Bush in Bratislava, the Slovak capital, in February 2005, he briefly maintained that the two countries' fundamental relations had probably never been at such a high level as they are now. It sounded very strained. The drumbeat of the accusations from Western human rights organizations protesting against atrocities in Chechnya, the clampdown on Russian media, the arrest of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the failure to curb corruption at every level, from the traffic cop on the street corner to government ministers and members of Putin's inner circle, the evidence that the Kremlin was imposing an ever more authoritarian and arbitrary regime, all that combined to make Western public opinion and Western politicians, many of whom had initially been willing to give Putin the benefit of the doubt, redoubled their criticisms. Even as Putin was extolling his personal relationship with Bush, the Russian press was writing that the relations of the West reverted to what they had been during the Cold War. The Chinese media, normally wary of commenting on affairs of Beijing's partners, called the relationship an alliance of convenience. A German commentator wrote that behind the facade of amity, a kind of proxy war is being waged. That came out most clearly over the US democracy promotion campaign. At the start of the second term, Bush had promoted Condoleezza Rice to be Secretary of State, replacing Colin Powell, whom Putin later described as one of the few generally very agreeable partners among the US officials who we dealt with. If that sounded like a jab at Rice, it was intended as such. The Iron Magnolia, as the Russian press dubbed her, had taken up her new post with guns blazing. Shortly before visiting Moscow in April, she called on Putin not to stand again as president when his second term ended in 2008, and then followed up with an interview with the Ekna Moskvy, in which she complained that Russia needed more democracy and that Putin had concentrated too much power in his own hands. That's a bit rich coming from that administration in the US, when they enforced the Patriot Act, which of course most Americans now regret, knowing it was a huge power grab from the US government, from the federal government. Democracy, he retorted, is not a commodity that can simply be exported from one country to another, is what Putin said. Democracy, he retorted, is not a commodity that can simply be exported from one country to another. It is a product of society's internal development. Russia had no future without democracy, but it had to be governed using methods best suited to its conditions and not in the same way as in some European countries or the United States. President Bush had some sympathy with that. He would never expect Russia to look like America, he said. Instead, he would have a Russian-style democracy. The neocons in his entourage, Rice among them, took a different view. The issue kept coming up and hitting a raw nerve. When a British journalist suggested a parallel between human rights situation in Russia and Africa, Putin responded coldly. Here's what he said. We know that in some African countries, until quite recently, it was the practice to eat one's political opponents. We don't have this practice, so I consider any comparison in this area to be tactless. The reference was to Jean Bedel Bokassa, a self-proclaimed emperor of the former Central African Republic, who was widely believed to have engaged in political cannibalism in the 1970s. The retort went down well in Russia, but like many of Putin's off-color sallies, produced a shocked silence among the Westerners present. There were other irritants. America was planning to open military bases in Bulgaria and Romania. There had been no progress towards a compromise on the US national missile defense system, and no progress on nuclear disarmament. The days when Putin had called for close relations with NATO were in distant past. Now he had complained about the alliance's double standards. On one hand, the West urged recognition of the independence of Kosovo, which is legally part of Serbia, threatening the invulnerability of Europe's post-war frontiers. On the other, it closed its eyes when Latvia classed nearly 500,000 Russian residents as, quote, non-citizens and denied them political writes, "It was with the problems of Russian diaspora in mind, the 25 million Russians who, almost from day one to the next, have found themselves expatriates in the newly independent post-Soviet states, that in an address to the houses of the Russian parliament in April, Putin asserted that the collapse of the Soviet Union was, quote, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century." Most of you are probably familiar with that quote. The phrase was unfortunate. It made him look like an unreconstructed Soviet apologist whose aim in life was to restore the USSR, as in before. In fact, he already stated on multiple occasions, while the Soviet period was a complicated page of our history, heroic, constructive, yet also tragic, it's a page that has been turned. That ship has sailed. Excuse me. All he had meant by calling it a catastrophe, he maintained later, was that it was a humanitarian disaster. He wasn't wrong. Historians would not disagree with that statement. In fact, there was more to it than that. The word geopolitical was key. He had inadvertently opened a window onto what he really believed. For Putin, as for most Russians of his generation, the end of the USSR had been an earth-shattering event. Asked many years later what influenced him most and what he would most likely be able to undo, he replied, quote, the Soviet Union's collapse. Okay. So, we've got a little bit more. We could probably do that on Friday. Okay. And just keep you informed as you just heard me speak. Well, I know it's can be a bit like a droning on the aspect of Putin and the way he thinks, what happened behind the scenes, the relationship between America and NATO and so on. That bit there you obviously just heard. The other thing I want to bring to your attention before we wrap up the stream, I'd like to thank everybody for being here, to obviously listen to everything I've said. It's quite something. I post this on Telegram, and I'll just show it on the screen so you guys can see for yourself. Just put things better. So in 2014 he said this. And if I can get it on the screen, it would help, wouldn't it? There we go. So if I just get that, it'll be below, just on the bottom right hand corner. Okay. Extend a bit more. Okay. So to them to think that he was just playing games, this has been going on for years. Right, this isn't new. So just here. He denounced what he called the global domination of one superpower and its allies that emerged. Quote, they cheated us again and again, made decisions behind our back, presenting us with completed facts. He said, that's the way it was with the expansion of NATO in the East. With the deployment of military infrastructure at our borders, they always told us the same thing. Well, this doesn't involve you. Now, that was in 2014. I've read you stuff before that, back in 2005. So it gets to a point where, like 15 years in 16, 17, 18, 19 years, get 2020, 2021, 2022, Putin's saying, enough of these games, we're not going to tolerate this anymore. And by chance, might be just a coincidence, they decide to start their own, have a competitor to America's US dollar. A multipolar world, an alternative new world order. And every time we're talking about Putin, it's worth coming back to this statement. Why is that? Because everything that's happening now is actually solely, not the only factor, but the main factor is this where Putin talked. This is after they took Crimea. Back then, he said that. They cheated us again and again. Made decisions behind our back presence with complete effects. That's the way it was with the expansion of NATO in the East, with the deployment of military infrastructure at our borders. They always told us the same thing. Well, it doesn't involve you. Well, it gets to the point where there's that saying, you get fed up turning the other cheek. Putin's been across how many leaders? Blair, Cameron, Johnson. Well, so I should say Theresa May briefly. I think Cameron maybe was Medvedev during that era, maybe also partly Putin as well, of course. In America, Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden. In Germany, Schroeder, Merkel been around for a long time. If you know how many leaders Germany have had, there's actually quite a few. Now you've got that clumsy fool called Schulz. In France, Chirac, Hollande, Sarkozy, Macron. At least Macron, even though he's a moron, he has some sanity in all this, saying, we've got to stop this. We've got to, we can see what China and Russia are doing here. But not listening to him. They're actually now trying to attack him for it. Let's get rid of this image now. You do what you do with Serbia. You break it apart into more smaller pieces. You then get them to join the EU to become part of a bigger, eventually of course, to join the EU, become part of a huge training bloc. And then you militarise them. You don't think we're not seeing this? We're actually literally seeing this over here. And you're saying this country called Serbia now you've encircled, and they're going to force Serbia to make a decision whether to sever its relationship with Russia and join the EU. Well, you know what? We're just going to push you back. And we're going to do this whilst at the same time we're doing this whole thing called BRICS and Shanghai Cooperation Organization, whatever it's called there. I think it's called SCO, I can't remember. Shanghai Cooperation Organization, I think. Expanding there. Getting Saudi Arabia and Iran to talk to each other. Getting Turkey getting involved now. Syria having normalized relations with the rest of the Arab states. Getting Egypt involved. Heck, even Israel might start to get cozy with these guys as well. And they wouldn't blame them because they're actually a bit of a problem right now. African countries turning along and shifting themselves towards Russia. Because obviously, someone like Macron's thinking, well, we're losing control over Africa as well. We're losing influence. We're being told to get the head out. They're literally telling us now to leave our countries. Get out. We don't want you here. So you can't blame Macron for trying to do what he's doing. And they talk about the part where I you about in Latvia they classed nearly 500,000 Russian residents as non-citizens. Well, you think when Russia look at this, they actually say, oh, that's our bad. We're cool. We're a big, huge country. We don't have to worry about this. No, we are concerned. Just as much as America would be concerned about their own citizens in other countries who are facing a problem like this, in a situation like this. British citizens, German, French, you name it.